Welcome again to those of you straggling in a little bit late. I'm Tom Nagorski again, and a moment ago I was talking about our exhibition of Buddhist treasures that have been in our galleries for the last few months from Myanmar. And I thought I'd share that when we first gathered about a year ago to think about what Myanmar-related programming we might do, because we build other programming around these exhibitions, a great many people said to me and to our team, you should try very hard to get George Soros to your building. Of course, George Soros has worked and devoted his time and considerable energies to so many parts of the world, but Myanmar, what was Burma, represents in some ways a classic case of the political, economic, and cultural circumstances that have so often captured this man's attention and his passion. A nation silenced for so many years by tyranny, cut off by diplomatic and economic isolation, and emerging at last from the tyranny and from the isolation. And of course, I'm not going to go into the long biography. I don't think it's necessary, and you have it in your program, but it's worth repeating that George Soros understands better than most, and he cares more than most about such things because he's known tyranny up close. He lived as a child through the tyranny of the Nazi occupation of his country. That country, Hungary, later suffered the tyranny of the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. And so George Soros has made it his mission, or one of his many missions, to give back, to commit himself, as his foundation says, and it says in your program, to quote, the idea of open society where rights are respected, government is accountable, and no one has a monopoly on the truth. He has fought for those ideals in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, in a great many places, and all these years later in Myanmar, supporting the students who led the democracy movement there. He did that a long time ago. The election process, the fledgling education system, and so on, all in the service of that same global mission. So today, we explore what must happen when societies open and when they emerge from these circumstances. Mr. Soros will be on stage in conversation with our own Orville Schell, director of the Arthur Ross Center here on U.S.-China relations. Delighted to have Janet Ross with us at Mr. Soros's table. Thank you, Janet, for all you and your family have done. Orville is, of course, one of the great scholars of the change and sometimes the lack of change that is occurring and that we are witnessing in today's China. Orville will moderate a conversation, then we'll open to your questions. And a reminder, we webcast these programs, so for those of you watching beyond this room, you may email questions to moderator@asiasociety.org, or you can tweet them using the hashtag AskAsia. For now, please join me in a warm welcome for George Soros and Orville Schell.
You're the first.
Oh, okay. You want to look? Yes.
No, I think
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, George, for joining us. And thank you, Yoshie Ito, who put this whole thing together. It was quite a production.
okay.
One of the reasons that I think we have here with us today a truly unique individual is that he's someone who believes in ideas as a writer, as a thinker, as an economist, but also someone who believes that ideas do have and should have consequences, and you should actually make ideas incarnate if you possibly can. And that really has been the conceit of his whole life. In many ways, sometimes, George, when I look at your various enterprises, you strike me almost as if you had or thought you had, a country of your own with its embassies around the world doing this, that, and the other with its own foreign policy. And that's a rather extraordinary accomplishment. And so this reaches out to many, many places in the world. And we thought, given the fact that we have this wonderful show you can stop in and see on the Buddhist art of Myanmar, want to quickly start there, but then to range elsewhere around the world where George and his foundation, the Open Society, institute and foundation have had quite an effect. So, George, let's start with Myanmar, and maybe explain a little bit why you got interested in this rather out-of-the-way place at a time when everybody else pretty much abandoned ship, namely around 1989.
Okay. Well, actually, we were engaged before when the democracy movement was brought on, was banished, and Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested, and we set up a project, Burma project, to support democracy. The democracy movement in Burma, and that's now more than 20 years ago, actually. So that was 84, and things got from bad to worse, and it was just an extremely frustrating experience. And
you were outside.
We were outside, and we were helping there was a government in exile, actually, that we supported, and also the refugees, particularly in Chiang Mai, in Thailand. That's where we were really active. But gradually, we also penetrated inside Burma and had a number of projects going on. But as I say, things got worse and worse. I was getting more and more impatient. I cut the funding, kept on reducing it because it seemed to be not getting anywhere, which actually made the whole thing much more effective, because the amounts we were distributing to civil society inside Burma were, extremely small, like $50 kind of grants, and therefore usually foundations acquire people who take advantage of the foundation, but there was not much advantage to be had. So we had really only the stalwarts who really believed in what they were doing. And then when it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, then there was a breakthrough. And then in 2011, at Christmas, I went to Burma as a student, as a tourist, and also stopped by in Naypyidaw and met with the president and his close entourage, which were basically 3 or 4 ministers who were very close to him, and they were the people pushing the reform, and they invited me to set up an official presence there, knowing full well that we were present unofficially, which we did. And in particular, the president asked to help build up a think tank that they were using to advise them on legislation and the reform program. And that think tank became the main intellectual push for reform, run by Zhao, who is somebody who had come back to help. So he had left. He was a professor of economics, and is doing a terrific job there. So it was a long payoff. sticking to it kind of paid off 20 years later, because we then had a very solid foundation in civil society and could be helpful to the government as well.
It's sort of the difference between a long-term investment and a short-term investment.
Well, I don't think that I ever had a financial investment as long-term as that. Well, the big difference between investing and being a philanthropist is when you're investing, you're purely interested in winning, whereas when you run what I call a political philanthropy, you have to stand for principles, and you have to fight losing battles. And if you fight them, eventually you may win.
But you also, if I may say, have lost a few. And you sort of specialized in countries that have reached those inflection points where they're in transition. And so talk about the difference between those countries where it's worked out and where it hasn't worked out.
Well, my first major effort, my first one was in South Africa, but afterwards Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire collapsed, and as the empire collapsed, I moved in and picked up the pieces. First in Hungary in 1984, and then Poland in 87, China in 87 as well. So this is how the Soros Empire was replacing the Soviet Empire.
And how do you think you're doing in your imperial ambitions?
Well, as you can see, you take Russia, which is actually where I'm most involved currently, and it's a replay, but of what we went through at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, the big difference is that then you had a moribund Soviet Union, and you had an emerging European Union. It was the height of the European Union, of the integration. And now you have the reverse. You have a resurgent Russia, and unfortunately, a disintegrating European Union. And that's a very sad development. But I think the foundation has made a contribution, so I consider it a success to be involved. And particularly because my main involvement actually in Ukraine, where there is a new Ukraine, which is eager to be part of the European Union and or to be a European democratic country. And actually, the people involved, almost every one of them, had been somehow in contact with the foundation. So it's both inside government and civil society. It's all people who I meet, and they tell me that somehow they are connected. And that is very gratifying. So 25 years of work has really paid off. So in that sense, it's similar to Myanmar. I think it's actually more successful because Myanmar is not currently doing that well, Burma, as I would have hoped. It made great progress for 3 years or so, but now with the elections coming, things are now regressing.
If you look at, I mean, I guess the two biggest and most consequential sort of pieces of global real estate, Russia and besides the United States, Russia and China are probably preeminent. And I wonder, you've had a substantial effort in each. You were really not involved within either country as much now, or really to any great effect as before. And I wonder how you look back on those involvements and what you think these two countries, what angle of repose are they going to find towards each other? Are we heading for a new alliance of the sort of former empires who feel beset upon by the West, victimized by the West, or is this just a temporary marriage of convenience?
You mean
Russia and China, yeah. There's a lot in that question, but how you view your own involvement in each and where you think they're headed.
Well, I set up a foundation in China in 1985, actually, 84, 85.
Which were the most open years, really, of the whole 20th century.
And I closed the foundation in 89. At one time we had some reconciliation, but basically the foundation has never been welcome again. So it was 84 to 89 that I was deeply involved there. Now you have got a rapprochement between Russia and China, but I think it's a one-sided love affair, basically, because...
and who's doing the loving?
Well, Putin is doing the wooing, and China has the upper hand and is taking advantage of Putin's needs to find an ally. So there was a long-term contract for natural gas where they'd been negotiating, and Putin lowered the price, and China graciously accepted it. I mean, it's a little more than that, but as I say, it's one-sided, because China knows that the real market for its products is in the United States and in Europe, and wouldn't want to jeopardize those markets by being too close to Russia. And now you have the formation of the what is it?
International Infrastructure Bank. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a big step forward for China. And I think that the Western countries have made a mistake in not allowing China and the other developing world to have a bigger say in the Bretton Woods institutions, which are basically controlled by either United States. One is by the United States, that's the World Bank, and the IMF by Europe. They have a sort of stranglehold on the nominating the president, and I think it would have been better to bring the developing world in, rather than to now create a situation where they are forming rival institutions.
Well, this gets to the dysfunctionality of Washington, because isn't it the case that Obama did have some modest amendment to China's role that Congress just locked up?
Absolutely. Couldn't get it through Congress. And Europe also didn't want to budge on the IMF. And that weakens those organizations.
So, I mean, you seem to have had a real fascination for those moments in myriad countries' histories where they are sort of trying to reinvent themselves, where something stops and something else begins. And Myanmar, we don't quite know the end game there. It's in transition. It has some problematic things. We have now Sri Lanka happening. So what is your sort of, how do you look conceptually at these countries that you move into with tremendous energy and optimism and substantial resources when they hit these moments of...
Well, these are windows of opportunity. While they are open, you want to walk in. And the sooner you do it, and the more effective, the early times are the times when you can make the biggest contribution. So that's basically. I'm now looking at Sri Lanka because I think there is a change there, very important, and. If they're facing elections, and if they are successful, then I think you could really have a change which is really repressive, quite bloody regime, yielding to a democratic or opening. So. Sri Lanka is, I'm just at the beginning to, just had a first sort of exploration.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you look at these countries, George, you have to acknowledge that it used to be the case we thought, well, if you just get rid of Saddam Hussein, dictator X, Y, Z, democracy would spring forth like, Athena out of the head of Zeus. But it doesn't work out that way. So what I mean, you seem to tread where sometimes angels fear to go.
Yeah. That's my specialty. Not being an angel, by the way. At any rate, it's the lesson you learn is that it takes much longer, and it's probably not one lifetime is not really enough to see in many cases. I mean, there are some. When I look at, let's say, today's Poland, it has changed, but let's say Russia, which will change, but it's more ripe for change now, having invested 25 years. Well, we didn't last that long. I think we pulled out around 2000. So, but we continued with projects, and we are still engaged in Russia, even today. And I'm confident that Russia will mature, and it will change. Putin won't change now, because he has committed himself to a new form of his own brand of ethnic and religious and socially conservative nationalism. But he's now the prisoner of the genie that he allowed to come out of the bottle, and he won't be able to put it back. So Putin won't change. And people who think that he will are going to be disappointed, and they are making a mistake in confusing Russia with the Putin regime. In other words, one should engage in Russia, and we remain engaged in Russia even today, but it's not the Putin regime.
Okay, by that analogy then, how do you analyze, and we're here at the Asia Society, so how do you analyze the situation in China in terms of change, the sort of central motion of history? Where do you think it's going, and what do you think the right posture is for foundations like yours, civil society, but also government policy?
Well, we would be happy to be engaged in China, but we are not welcome. And therefore, and in fact, we actually have some projects in China, but we are extremely careful in disclosing what we are doing and making the authorities aware, and very often they disallow it because they have a very efficient political police, and I consider myself as typhoid Mary. In other words, the people whom we help, we don't help because they immediately are put into a different category and are much more closely examined. So it's better for us not to be active because we could be hurting the people whom we would want to help.
And what's your prognosis? You suggested that you're somewhat optimistic about Russia, Putin aside. How do you view?
Well, it's longer. I mean, that's a longer-term project.
But China?
Well, China, I think, is at a crossroads because it has been extremely successful, but it has to change its growth model. And if it's successful in making the transition, it could open up, become more open. It's because the reforms are they are market-oriented reform, economic reform, but political reform is not allowed, and that's an imbalance. For China to become a more open society, it needs political reform. But now it's in a difficult transition, and actually power is being centralized in the hands of the president, and I think it will not, if it's successful, and I think there's a reasonable chance that it will be successful. Then hopefully there'll be more room for political reform, and then you could have a new world order where China would be a very important member of a major power, and that would be the positive outcome. And if it's the economic transformation fails, then the fallback is to hold power, hold the country together by having some external conflict. Conflict with, obviously, China and Japan are set up for that. And then you have a very dismal prospect for the world. So I think in the longer term, that's probably the most important political issue, and how it works out will influence the history of mankind.
And what do you think the role both of the United States as the other preeminent power and also people like yourself in influencing and conditioning the outcome to that great wager?
Well, of course, how America acts is very important, and unfortunately, we are now in a very, very difficult global situation, because you actually have a collapse in global governance, and the absence of order leads to disorder. So we now have a period of global disorder, and that means that crises that used to be settled by some form of international intervention actually don't get settled. They fester and they accumulate. And as the numbers grow, each crisis could be settled perhaps on its own, but they are all interconnected. And the losers in one conflict tend to be the spoilers in the other conflicts. And therefore, the conflicts don't get settled. So you have them accumulating. If you go back, let's say the Israel-Palestinian conflict is probably one of the longest festering one, and they are not any closer to not any closer to solution. Then you have, Iraq, Syria, Iran. Now you have a potential solution with the partial solution with the Iranian nuclear issue, which could be the beginning of, let's say, Iran coming back into the global system. But there are very strong forces to want to prevent it, both here in the United States, and of course Russia is not eager for that to happen either.
Do you find yourself ever a little bit nostalgic for the kind of the almost satisfying order that the Cold War gave to the world?
Well, that was a certain kind of order, and it was.
At least you knew where to go.
No, it was easier because it was black and white. So I had a conceptual framework which I based on under the influence of Karl Popper, open and closed society, and it worked then. But then when the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, I learned that the collapse of a closed society doesn't necessarily lead to an open society. It can just lead to further collapse. And how far collapses can go seems to be quite unlimited. So I've seen countries that I'm very much involved. Let's say, take Haiti, where just incredible how things can go from bad to worse in terms of natural catastrophes compounding the political collapse. So there seems to be no end to how far disorder can go.
So if you were inclined to rename the Open Society Foundation to fit the more modern template, what would you call it?
Open Society Foundation.
Still.
Yeah. I think it's a good, yeah. Well, it's a little complicated concept, but I think it remains valid. Mm-hmm. It's based on critical thinking, and critical thinking led me to revise my simple concept of open and closed societies and make room for chaos. Exactly, failed states.
So I'm wondering, as you survey the globe and the various places where you've sort of wagered, what do you look at and say, that was good, that worked?
Any number, but what happens is it doesn't work that way, because when you have an aspiration, it's what I call a fantastic object. It's very attractive, and when it becomes reality, it's not quite as attractive as it was as an object of desire.
It's sort of like a beautiful woman who you've not yet gotten to know.
Well, I don't want to go in that direction,
but are you aware of your own kind of the limits of your own idealism as you plunge off to Sri Lanka, or you go into? I mean, what are you thinking to yourself when you say, "Let's go"?
No, I know that my understanding is limited, is biased, is distorted. I know that. It puts me one step ahead of most people who actually believe that they know what's right and wrong. I have a sense of it, but in practice, I often make mistakes. I've got to have I have to make decisions, and so I have to rely on whatever I believe, knowing that it may not be absolutely right, and therefore I'm open to revise it. And that's what you need to do. In other words, and that's what I say. I used to think that I come close to achieving my objectives, but I never do. But I've discovered that actually very often I do achieve my objectives, but when it becomes reality, it doesn't resemble that fantastic object that led me to desire it.
It's sort of like writing a book. You never know where you're going to go until you get there.
That's right.
Yeah.
But some people have a plan, actually. They know what they want to say. In my case, the book I am writing, I don't know where it's leading.
I share that.
You have the same
sentiment. Yeah, and I think it's a more exciting kind of expedition. So as you look around the world today, what great projects? Oh, before I ask you that, I wanted to just have you just ruminate for a minute in between your life as an investor, as a financier, and as a civil society philanthropist. How do these two things stack up in the estimation of your own sort of life's experience?
Well, they have a philosophical foundation, a conceptual framework that I've worked out that had great doubts whether I would have liked to and I still would like to make a contribution to mankind's understanding of reality, but I doubted it. I considered myself as a failed philosopher. That changed in 2008 with the financial collapse, the crisis, because the conceptual framework helped me both to survive it as an investor, but also to try to at least explain it, even predict it, but the prediction was naturally incomplete because the timing I didn't get right. I thought it would happen much earlier, and it happened two years later.
Not bad.
Yeah, but you can lose a lot of money.
Short. Well, the difference between a philosopher and a financier.
So since then, I actually believe that this conceptual framework based on fallibility, reflexivity, and the human uncertainty principle actually may be a contribution to our understanding of reality, because our imperfect understanding plays a very important role in shaping the course of events. So you take something like the Euro crisis, where I've written books about it, and the role of imperfect understanding and distortions and misconceptions play a very important role in shaping the course of events.
It's sort of the Heisenberg principle applied to finance.
Yes, it's and there's even, I've recently discovered actually a similarity between the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and my human uncertainty principle. It has to do with the inherent uncertainty of our own identity. In other words, we think we know who we are, but we actually are not quite what we think we are. Mm-hmm. And our identity, our behavior can change depending on the role we play. And so sometimes we behave as particles, as freestanding individuals, making our decisions and thinking of our own best interests. And sometimes we get caught up in a wave. In subatomic elements, sometimes, according to Heisenberg, behave as can be observed as waves and sometimes as particles. And the same is true of human beings.
Well, now we are on the abyss of a
philosophy.
Of a vast canyon of discussion, which maybe we'll have to save for another day. Let's turn to you all for questions. Please be really brief and speak clearly, and maybe tell us very quickly who you are. And let's keep every question short because George only has a limited amount of time here. So who would like to lead off? Yeah, right here, Bill.
What is necessary to restore the European Union to the direction of its true vision?
It's a very good question, and I'm very much engaged in that. And I think actually the new Ukraine could play that role if it succeeds, because the original concept of individual states coming together and sacrificing part of their sovereignty for the common good. It was an association of equals, a voluntary association of equals. And then the Euro crisis changed this because it was formed into a relationship between creditors and lenders, where and borrowers, and the borrowers had difficulty meeting their obligations, and the creditors were in charge in setting the conditions for settling. And so it became an involuntary association of unequals, and something that had been a fantastic object. Actually, for people living in the heavily indebted countries, let's say under 50 years old, became the enemy that was depriving them of a better future. So I think it would be highly desirable to recapture the original spirit. And I think if the European Union had the wisdom and foresight to assist the new Ukraine to survive, the new Ukraine could bring them together, and this new Ukraine that I'm so devoted to is actually has the spirit of volunteerism and participating democracy, not just elected, not just representative democracy, but actually participatory democracy. It's quite a unique experiment, and it is succeeding. It has a lot of inner strength. It has certainly exceeded my expectations to survive in very adverse conditions. And if it does succeed, it could change the European Union. But unfortunately, the European Union is not somehow even aware of this new Ukraine, and is not at the moment willing to do what it takes to make it succeed. It regards Ukraine as just another Greece, and not even a member, and is therefore not giving it the support that it deserves.
I should say that George has written a number of very interesting articles about this topic in the New York Review of Books that you all might like to take a look at. Yes. Wait for the microphone, please. Yeah. And do introduce yourself, just so.
My name is Anthony Viscusi. Don't you think that the biggest flaw of the European Union has been to accept new members without first achieving the integration of the existing members?
Well, I think it was actually something that carried the European Union forward, that it was able to absorb new members as they became available because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it enlarged the Union, and today, actually, the new members are in many ways politically and economically healthier than the old members. If you look at the Baltic states and Poland, remarkably, Romania is coming through now, very little recognized by dealing with corruption very effectively in the last year or so. So that's actually the most promising part of the European Union.
Right here, the woman right in the middle.
I'm Serena Dean with the International Emergency Medical Response Agency. And as closed societies become open societies, what are your thoughts on, in a post-9/11 world, preventing radicalization, using as an example marginalized Muslims in Myanmar? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the situation of the ethnic and religious conflict that has emerged in Myanmar is the most disturbing part of the process, and it could destroy. That could destroy the process of reform, which otherwise may be currently stopping, but would continue otherwise. So the persecution of the Rohingya in particular is which is a result of a deliberate incitement for actually political purposes to influence the election results is now sort of a reactionary force that needs to be brought under control, and I very much hope that Thein Sein, the president, and the reformers will try to do something about it in the near term while he's the president. So that, I think, is what is going to determine his legacy, historical legacy, whether he will be able to put that genie back into the bottle.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Let's take the woman in the middle, right in the doorway.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline Price, and I'm a trustee of the New York State Nurses Association pension. I'm very interested in knowing not only the governments that you support over the long period of time, but the grassroots of women. There are 17 million nurses across the world who have constant communication with their societies at a no power level, but have great influence in the home life and what the societies want. And is there any support that is in the minds of those that you are working with to face the grassroots and start to turn around where actually the quiet power is in this world today?
Well, what comes to mind is our effort started out, was called the Project on Death in America, and that was to help people in the process of dying, which is, of course, an inevitable process, but how it occurs, how much pain and suffering is involved, can vary a great deal. And how should I say, the unwillingness to accept a death as a natural part of life has actually created a lot of unnecessary suffering. And that's where nurses and health givers and doctors can make a contribution. And I would say that was one of our most successful efforts as a foundation. And there are other areas now in other parts of the world, say in Ebola, the health system is absolutely necessary. And now that Ebola is being brought under control, it's very important to build up the health systems of the countries that are affected, because otherwise Ebola is bound to come back. So that is another project that we are very actively involved in. So we have, and also this, let's say, palliative care has become now a global movement. We have ended our project in America, but we continue it in the rest of the world.
George, since we have about 2 minutes, let me just end by asking you how you view over the last few decades, how is your view on the importance of civil society evolved?
Well, the foundation basically sees it as its mission to support civil society in holding governments responsible, accountable. And this is a mission that will not end with my life. There is a need for a foundation to support that globally. And that's, let's say, the core activity that will continue after my death. The other stuff that we talked about, that's more entrepreneurial, and whether the foundation will be able to continue it or not, I try to prepare it so that it will, but that is more questionable.
Well, George, thanks so much. And please join me in thanking George Soros for being with us. Thank you.